It was just another typical summer night in 2013 in Burgon, North Carolina, for Officer Brett Wilkins and his partner, Officer Carlos Ramirez. They were on the overnight patrol shift, driving along back roads that wound through the dense forests and swamplands surrounding the small town. Around 2 a.m., the dispatch radio crackled with a report of a disturbance near the Green Swamp Preserve, just west of town. Wilkins switched on the overhead lights and siren as he pushed the cruiser up to speed. When they arrived at the area indicated by the call, they found a couple's car pulled over on the shoulder, the man and woman still inside looking visibly shaken. Wilkins approached the driver's side window as the man rolled it down slowly. "Evening, folks. We got a call about a disturbance out here. Everything okay?" The man's face was drained of color as he struggled to find the words. His wife, sitting in the passenger seat, was trembling and barely making eye contact. "Officer, you're not going to believe this," the man finally stammered out. "But we just saw a monster, a huge, scaly thing that ran across the road right in front of us." Wilkins and Ramirez exchanged one of those looks that all cops know. Here we go again, another one of those swamp ape goofballs spinning tall tales. Still, they had to pursue every call in a professional manner. The man continued, starting to regain his composure. "We were just driving down the road when this thing came barreling out of the woods. It was huge with muscular legs and a long, thick tail dragging behind it. It looked like some kind of gigantic lizard almost, but it was running upright like a man. Biggest thing I've ever seen in my life." The woman finally spoke up, her voice still shaking. "The scales, they almost seemed to glow in our headlights when it crossed the road, and the eyes were like a fiery yellow." Ramirez took over the questioning, while Wilkins looked around the area with a flashlight. As crazy as it sounded, the couple certainly did seem genuinely scared out of their wits. He swept the beam around the heavily wooded area on both sides of the road, but saw no immediate signs of any large creatures or disturbances. That's when his light fell upon a series of strange depressions and marks in the muddy shoulder. He motioned for Ramirez to come take a look, as the couple anxiously looked on from inside their car. The two officers examined the prints, clearly left by some sort of huge bipedal creature with long appendages and heavy musculature. Each footprint was easily 18 to 24 inches long, sinking 4 to 5 inches into the soft mud, with 3 distinct claw marks at the end. Whatever left these was definitely massive. They followed the trail for about 50 yards into the tree line, where it appeared the creature had entered a particularly thick kudzu patch and swampy area. That's when an ungodly bellow shattered the silence of the night, a strange bark-like roar that seemingly shook the trees around them. The officers immediately went for their sidearms, scanning wildly with flashlights and trying to pinpoint the source of the deafening sound. That's when they caught sight of it. Barely 40 yards away, pushing its way through the kudzu vines and tangled shrubbery, was the largest living creature Wilkins and Ramirez had ever witnessed. It easily stood over 8 feet tall, covered in iridescent scales that almost seemed to glow from within. The tail, as long and thick as a grown man's body, whipped angrily behind it as it advanced. But it was the head and face that struck the most terror into the two seasoned officers. An elongated dinosaur-like muzzle filled with rows of fangs, and the wide, unblinking yellow orbs that seemed to bore straight through them. The creature reared up, unleashing another ear-splitting roar as it displayed massive hooked claws and a mouth large enough to swallow their heads whole. That was enough to break the trance. "Back to the cruiser now," Wilkins shouted as they turned and sprinted in sheer panic. "Get out of here! Get out of here!" Wilkins then screamed at the stunned couple, still frozen in their vehicle up the road. Thankfully, they snapped out of it, the man throwing the car into drive as the wife let out a blood-curdling scream. Their tires sprayed gravel as they peeled out, the little sedan fishtailing wildly, before finding traction on the asphalt and disappearing around a bend. The two officers turned their attention back to the looming monster. Barely 30 yards away now, its jaws unhinged in another ear-splitting roar, revealing row after row of serrated fangs easily over a foot long. Wilkins raised his voice. "Brunswick County Police, get back! Get back right now!" But the creature seemed unfazed, continuing its advance with those huge thudding steps. Ramirez reached across and flipped on the spotlights mounted on the front wedge of their cruiser, bathing the monster in blazing white light. It recoiled slightly, throwing a hand-like claw up to shield its eyes from the glare. The two officers could see it more clearly now. Those iridescent green and orange scales covered a massively muscled torso that gradually transitioned into its thick reptilian lower body and powerful tail. It opened its fanged mouth again, this time letting out more of a hissing growl. "Last warning," Wilkins bellowed, leveling his shotgun squarely at the creature's head. Beside him, Ramirez had unholstered his service pistol as well. He didn't want to fire the weapon, but was prepared to take down this thing, whatever the hell it was. For a few eternal seconds, the creature almost seemed to be weighing its next move, its eerie yellow eyes shifting between the two officers as they stood their ground behind the cruiser's open doors. Then, with surprising quickness, it whipped its head down and sprinted back towards the tree line. Wilkins and Ramirez could only watch in stunned silence as the sounds of its massive footfalls and the snapping of branches rapidly receded into the distance. Their hearts were pounding, sweat-soaked uniforms clinging to them. After a few minutes, backup units from the Pender County Sheriff's Office began arriving to assist with the disturbance. But by then, the creature was long gone, seemingly vanishing into the vast green swamp wilderness without a trace. In the days and weeks that followed, a few more reported sightings of the so-called green swamp monster trickled in from locals and visitors to the area. Some claimed to have spotted its huge form, lurking at night near the swamps, or heard those chilling bellows echoing through the trees. A few had even captured blurred images or footage, but nothing definitively conclusive. To this day, Officers Wilkins and Ramirez have never forgotten that harrowing summer night and the sight of that colossal reptilian creature. They know what they witnessed on that desolate stretch of road was no myth or legend. Whatever it was very real, and still lurks in the murky blackwater swamps of coastal North Carolina.
It was the spring of 2021 when my wife Denise and I went on a one-week vacation to New Orleans. We had heard so many stories about the city's vibrant culture, fascinating history, and delicious food that is unlike anywhere else. Naturally, we were super excited to finally experience it all with our own eyes and taste buds.
On our third night there, after filling our bellies with a hearty meal of gumbo, we found ourselves feeling restless and eager for a little adventure. That's when we hatched the idea to take a moonlit stroll through one of New Orleans' famous above-ground cemeteries we had learned about earlier in the day. Our tour guide from earlier had sternly warned us against wandering into these cemeteries after dark, citing potential dangers, but we waved off her concerns at the time. Being naive, we figured she was simply overplaying the risks to keep rowdy tourists out of trouble. As we passed through the wrought iron entrance gates, an unsettling sensation immediately washed over me. The air felt heavy and unnaturally still, with an almost oppressive silence blanketing the grounds, punctuated only by the occasional rustle of leaves from a gentle breeze. We pressed onward, taking in the sights of the ornate, weathered tombs and stately monuments that lined the maze-like pathways snaking through the cemetery. The atmosphere was undeniably eerie, but also strangely captivating in its own macabre way. Suddenly, Denise came to an abrupt halt, her grip on my arm tightening as her eyes widened with visible concern. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her tone edged with apprehension. I strained my ears, but the only sound that reached them was the familiar background noise of leaves dancing in the wind's embrace. "Hear what?" I responded, striving to keep my voice level and reassuring despite the growing knot in my stomach. Denise slowly shook her head, her brow furrowed deeply. "I could have sworn I heard a strange scratching noise coming from over there," she said, gesturing toward a tightly clustered group of larger tombs off to our left.
We both froze in place, our senses on high alert as we listened intently for any unusual sounds. That's when the noise reached my ears as well, an unmistakable rhythmic scratching that reverberated with disturbing clarity, like something large and forceful was scraping against solid stone. My heart immediately kicked into high gear, pounding forcefully against my ribcage as my mind raced with possibilities. A stray branch, perhaps, or something far more disturbing. The scratching seemed to grow progressively louder and more insistent, prompting us to turn as one toward the source of the grating racket. That's when I saw it. A gargantuan, hunched figure crouched in the shadows behind one of the larger tombs, its enormous claws digging deep into the stone surface with horrifying ease, sending fragments of rock and debris raining down around it. As the beast shifted ever so slightly, pale rays of moonlight filtering through the branches overhead illuminated its form, and I felt a sickening chill run the entire length of my spine. It was unlike anything I had ever witnessed, not even in my darkest nightmares. A towering reptilian-like creature with a body covered in a thick, scaly hide. Its elongated head gave me mental images of alligators and crocodiles, but with an array of jagged, dagger-like teeth jutting menacingly from its mouth. Denise let out an involuntary whimper of sheer terror, and the creature's head whipped around with startling speed, its beady black eyes locking onto us with predatory intensity. In that singular moment, time itself seemed to grind to a halt, as we found ourselves utterly paralyzed, our limbs stubbornly refusing to obey the desperate urges of our minds, screaming at us to run. The beast unleashed a reverberating growl that shook the very foundations of the cemetery. It then began advancing toward us with forceful steps, each fall of its huge claws leaving behind deep, jagged gouges in the earth. "Run!" I finally managed to croak out to Denise, my voice little more than a rasp as terror constricted my throat. Without a moment's hesitation, we turned on our heels and sprinted toward the entrance gate as adrenaline flooded our veins. Yet no matter how hard we pushed ourselves, we could not escape the sounds of the creature's relentless pursuit. The heavy, earth-shaking footfalls growing louder and nearer with each passing second, accompanied by the chilling sound of its claws tearing into the ground. As the gate finally came into view, I made the mistake of glancing over my shoulder and immediately felt my blood turn to ice in my veins. The creature was rapidly closing the distance, its nightmarish mouth open to reveal rows of curved, serrated fangs, glistening with foul-smelling spittle. We barreled through the gate and fled blindly into the night, no longer conscious of any destination. All we cared about was putting as much distance between us and that thing as humanly possible. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs nearly gave out from sheer exhaustion. Yet we dared not stop, nor even look back, until we found ourselves staggering through the doors of our hotel in the city's French Quarter. To this very day, no matter how hard I try, I cannot rationalize or make sense of what we encountered that night. Was it an extraordinary biological entity yet to be documented by science? An insane horror from ancient mythology? Or was it something that defies all categorization? Something far beyond the limited comprehension of the human mind? Whatever the truth may be, I know this: that encounter shattered me and changed me in ways I cannot adequately describe. New Orleans will forever be a place of deep unease for me now, a place where the walls separating the known and unknown seems way too thin, where unspeakable nightmares lurk just beyond the limits of our perception.
It was a cool, crisp evening in late September when my wife Lisa and I headed out to Yellowstone National Park for a camping trip. We had this getaway planned for months, and we were stoked to ditch the city for a few days and just head out to where life was more peaceful and relaxed. We even both promised to put our phones away for the trip.
We pulled into our reserved campsite just before sundown and quickly got to setting up our tent and fire pit. The last rays of dusk were disappearing as we sparked up the campfire. Soon the only light came from the flames and a sky filled with brilliant stars. After a couple hours around the fire, roasting up some food and listening to the peaceful sounds of crickets and owls and crackling wood, we decided to hit the hay around midnight. We put out the fire and crawled into our cozy tent. It wasn't long before I was just beginning to drift into that blissful pre-sleep state when a massively loud thud outside jolted me fully awake. I lay there holding my breath, straining my ears to try and figure out what direction the sound had come from. That's when I heard it. Heavy, rhythmic footsteps, and I swear that they were slowly approaching our campsite. Terrifyingly, each step shook the ground with a thunderous, earth-shaking force. There is no way that a bear or elk could possibly produce those sounds. My heart jackhammering, I reached over and shook Lisa's shoulder to rouse her. She woke with a groggy start as I held my finger to my lips and mouthed, "Listen." Soon enough, her eyes grew saucer-wide as the bizarre, lumbering footsteps continued to come nearer. We tried our best to figure out what to do, but we were basically trapped inside as the footfalls finally reached a spot right outside our tent. That's when we heard the most profoundly grisly growl imaginable. It was like no sound I've ever heard from nature before, or even since. A deep gurgling sound that made every hair on my body stand on end, and my blood run cold. Without warning, our tent suddenly began violently shaking and convulsing. Something enormous and immensely powerful was attacking us, grabbing at the fabric and punching the sides, barely missing our heads a few times. Lisa screamed at the top of her lungs as I clumsily pawed around for my flashlight, my body rigid with sheer terror. When the beam finally lit, I unzipped the door a bit and gasped and recoiled at the sight before me. In front of me and staring me down was the most horrific beast I've witnessed in nightmares or waking life. It towered at least 9 feet tall. Its entire body was matted in coarse, dingy fur. Its build was vaguely humanoid, but with proportions and size so gargantuan, so beyond the realm of human, it was difficult for my mind to fully process. The creature was slightly hunched over, its massive, claw-tipped hands leaving deep gouges in the earth each time it struck at our tent. Its face had slanting eyes that shone black as night, flaring nostrils flush against a snout-like muzzle, and curved fangs that were at least 3 inches long. We were utterly petrified and pulled back to flatten ourselves against the back of the tent as the hellish ape-man proceeded to batter at our shelter. Its wild roars and grunts shook everything around. Just when I thought our tent was about to be ripped apart with us inside it, the growling suddenly stopped. Next, everything went unnervingly silent. We remained flattened against the tent, in the darkness, too fear-stricken to even whimper as we tried to determine our next step, even though neither one of us could form a sentence. Then, very gradually, we began to hear the telltale heavy footsteps slowly lumbering around the tent in circles. We later agreed that we both counted 5 rounds around the tent before we heard it continue into the forest, as if our tent had been right in the middle of its path. Even after we could no longer hear any sound, we remained statue still and huddled together, occasionally taking heaving breaths, until dawn began to show over the horizon. When we finally found the courage to carefully unzip the tent totally and look around outside, we were met with a scene of utter chaos. The entire area surrounding our campsite was destroyed. Huge tracts of earth were gouged and uprooted, as if whatever had been stalking us had been pacing and stomping the whole night. It was honestly as if it was totally pissed off at us for setting up camp right in its way. Nearby trees were scratched and gashed with bark stripped away. Our fire pit was scattered. Any feelings of peace and tranquility we'd felt the previous night were irrevocably shattered and memories destroyed. To this day, I don't have any rational explanation for what in God's name we encountered during that September night in Yellowstone and why it was so darn mad at us. All we can say is that something terrifying and unholy roams those woods at night. We're both forever traumatized by the experience. Whatever it was we crossed paths with under that starry sky, it definitely isn't something we ever want to see again. Truth be told, we don't even want to talk about it or hear about it again. It's honestly that traumatic for us, even until this day.
Next up, I've got a wild tale that is straight out of the swamps of Georgia, and this one will really make you scratch your head. So there I was, knee-deep in the murky swamp water, studying reptiles and sweating like a dog in the hot southern sun. I was studying how different reptiles have adapted to live in this swamp environment. Little did I know, I was about to stumble upon something way weirder than a snake with leg stumps.
I was slogging through the muck, swatting mosquitoes the size of quarters, when I noticed something really out of place. There was a dark opening in the vegetation, like a hidden entrance or tunnel. My curiosity got the best of me, and I decided to go investigate. After crawling through the damp opening, I found myself in a narrow tunnel that twisted and turned deep underground. Moss and roots dangled from the dirt ceiling, and the air felt thick and stale. After what felt like an hour of carefully making my way through the tunnel, I emerged into a vast underground cavern. No joke, this thing was absolutely massive, easily bigger than a football stadium. And here's where things started getting really bizarre. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I realized this wasn't just any old cave. There were crumbling stone structures, carvings on the walls, and other signs that some sort of ancient civilization had existed down here at some point. The structures didn't look human-made, though. The architecture had a distinct reptilian style, with winding pathways, rounded doorways, and scale-like patterns everywhere. Were these ruins left behind by some race of intelligent reptile people? My mind was spinning just trying to comprehend what I was seeing. That's when I noticed movement in the shadows up ahead. A figure was approaching, slowly and cautiously. I held my breath, watching as it emerged into the light. And that's when I saw a giant freaking lizard person. It was at least 8 feet tall, covered in thick green scales, with a long snout filled with sharp teeth. It eyed me suspiciously, almost like it was just as surprised to see me as I was to see it. I'll be honest, I almost passed out from shock and fear right then and there. What the heck was going on? Had I fallen down a hole into another dimension or something? The lizard creature didn't seem overtly threatening, though. It kind of cocked its head at me and gave me a little wave with one of its clawed hands. Somehow, I managed a feeble wave back. As confusing and mind-blowing as this experience was, I realized I may have just uncovered one of the biggest archaeological discoveries in history. Proof that an advanced reptilian civilization once thrived right below our feet in the swamps of Georgia. Either that or the southern humidity had finally made me snap, and I was just hallucinating the whole thing. I guess there was only one way to find out. The deeper I ventured into the underground city, the more strange and unsettling things I encountered. There were piles of what looked like shed reptilian skin and bones. Eerie carvings and symbols were etched everywhere, depicting serpentine figures locked in battle or ritual ceremony. The air was heavy and dank, with an underlying musky odor I couldn't quite place. At one point, I came across a vast open area filled with mounds of dirt and roots. As I shone my flashlight on them, I noticed they weren't mounds at all. They were nests, massive nests easily big enough to harbor creatures the size of the lizard person I encountered. A chill ran down my spine thinking about what other giant reptilian horrors might be lurking down here, guarding their eggs. I'll admit I briefly considered turning back at that point. Who knew what other nightmarish beasts were stalking these tunnels and caverns? But I'd come too far, seen too much to turn back empty-handed. If I played my cards right, I could be the one to rewrite the entire history of reptilian life on planet Earth. Onward I pressed, eventually arriving at what seemed to be the city's innermost sanctum. It was a perfectly circular stone chamber, with a domed ceiling stretching hundreds of feet overhead. Strange symbols and pictograms covered every inch of the walls, written in some unknown reptilian language. As I ran my hands over the carvings, I could have sworn I felt an unnatural warmth radiating from them, like they were alive somehow. That's when I noticed it, a faint rumbling, and was that chanting I heard? It grew louder and seemed to reverberate all around me in the chamber. Something was happening, some sort of ritual or summoning. I immediately regretted my decision to delve this deep into the unknown. Panic and adrenaline surged through my body as the chanting intensified. Then, just as it reached a fever pitch, nothing. Dead silence and stillness. That's when it happened. From every side tunnel and crevice, they started pouring into the chamber. A horde of towering reptilian humanoids with glowing red eyes. Hunched over on all fours, their powerful tails swinging behind them, they advanced towards me slowly. Their jaws opened and closed, flashing rows of dagger-like teeth as they let out ear-piercing hisses. I was surrounded on all sides with no chance of escape. I sank to my knees, fearing this would be my last living moment on Earth. That's when the leader of the pack approached, a massive horned creature easily 12 feet tall. It leaned down until our faces were just inches apart. I could feel its hot, putrid breath on my face as it opened its mouth, forked tongue flicking out. The deafening hiss it let out nearly burst my eardrums. Just then, a blinding light flooded the chamber, causing the reptilian beast to recoil and thrash about. As my eyes slowly readjusted, I saw the light was coming from the entrance tunnel. A search party had found their way in. "Over here!" I screamed at the top of my lungs. "Help! Get me out of here!" The reptilian monsters were in a frenzied panic, hissing and clawing at the bright lights. I could hear voices calling out, getting closer. With a surge of adrenaline, I scrambled to my feet and sprinted towards the light source. Suddenly, I felt a massive scaly tail whip across my legs, sending me crashing to the ground. I looked back in horror as the largest reptilian beast towered over me, jaws unhinged and dripping with putrid saliva. This was it. I was done for. That's when a booming voice echoed from the tunnel. "Get away now!" A bright flare fired towards the creature, causing it to recoil and hiss violently. I felt a pair of strong arms grabbing me and dragging me away towards the entrance. As the lights grew brighter, I could make out my rescuers, park rangers from the swamp preserve. What in the hell were those things? One of them kept muttering over and over as we scrambled back through the winding tunnels. I didn't have any answers. Only the haunting memory of those monsters seared into my mind. All I knew was that I was lucky to make it out of there alive. In the end, I decided to leave out the more unbelievable details in my official report. I documented the underground cavern and tunnel system, made note of the fossilized bones and shed reptilian skins to suggest some kind of long-extinct large lizard species. But those humanoid-like creatures, their glowing eyes and apparent intelligence, I kept that to myself, chalking it up to a mind playing tricks after weeks of grinding field work in the southern heat. Better to let that mystery remain buried, rather than risk having anyone else stumble into that reptilian nightmare. It was a warm summer evening in August when John and his family headed off on their camping trip to the Coconino National Forest near Flagstaff, Arizona. They had been planning the trip for months, eager to get out there and see what all adventures they would find. On the second day of the trip, John's 12-year-old son, Tommy, asked if he could take their dog, Buddy, for a short walk around the campsite. John agreed, reminding Tommy to stay within sight and not to wander too far. About 15 minutes later, John realized that Tommy and Buddy were no longer in sight. He called out for them, but there was no response. Concerned, John and his wife began searching around the surrounding area, but there was no sign of either Tommy or Buddy. As night fell, John and his wife became increasingly worried. They contacted the park rangers, who immediately organized a search party. Throughout the night, teams of rangers and volunteers combed the area, using flashlights and calling out for Tommy and Buddy. The next morning, as the search continued, John and his wife were approached by a disheveled-looking man who claimed to have seen something strange the previous night. According to the man, he was out hiking in a remote area of the forest when he came across a large, strange creature walking on two legs. The man described the creature as being at least 7 feet tall, with broad shoulders and long, shaggy fur covering its entire body. He stated that the creature was carrying something in its arms, but he couldn't make out what it was. Understandably, John and his wife were skeptical of the man's story. but they couldn't help but feel some hope and wonder if it had any connection to the disappearance of Tommy and Buddy. Later that day, the search party made a startling discovery. In a densely wooded area about a mile from the campsite, they found Buddy, crouching, hiding under a downed tree, shaking and unharmed, but visibly terrified. However, heartbreakingly, there was still no sign of Tommy. The search continued for several more days, with no further sightings of any alleged creature or any clues as to Tommy's whereabouts. John and his family were forced to return home to regroup, while other search parties continued. They were desperate for answers. Days went by without any news, until one day, a ranger called with an incredible update. Tommy had been found, alive and relatively unharmed, deep in the forest. When asked what had happened, Tommy's account was both puzzling and totally chilling. As soon as he was reunited with his frantic parents, they tried not to bombard him with too many questions about where he had been and what happened. At first, Tommy seemed dazed and had trouble recounting the events, but after being given some time, he began to slowly recount his harrowing tale. After Buddy and I walked a little way from the campsite, we saw something really big moving through the trees, Tommy said, his eyes wide with fear at the memory. It was huge and covered in fur. Buddy started pulling to get over to it like crazy. Tommy said the creature suddenly turned and fixed its gaze directly on them. That's when Buddy stopped moving forward and tucked his tail between his legs. Then the thing started coming toward us on two legs. I was so scared, Tommy continued. I turned and ran as fast as I could, but I could hear it crashing through the forest right behind me, and I didn't even realize that I was running away from you guys. He said he ran blindly, stumbling over fallen branches and rocks, just trying to get away. Finally, he dared to look back, and the creature was gone. But he had become hopelessly lost in the thick forest and had no idea where Buddy was. For days, Tommy wandered aimlessly, eating whatever he could identify as safe from some simple instructions he had learned at Boy Scouts, and drinking from fast-flowing streams. At night, he could hear strange howls and creepy noises echoing through the trees that made it impossible to relax and sleep. One morning, he awoke to an eerie sight. Massive footprints pressed into the soft earth all around where he had been sleeping. That was the first and only night he allowed himself to totally fall asleep for any length of time. Tommy knew then that he, for sure, wasn't alone in these woods. His family listened in stunned silence as he described how he would find bent trees and broken branches, evidence that something gigantic was moving all around him, just out of sight. He felt like he was being watched, hunted almost, and he had been scared to death. Finally, after nearly a week alone in the forest, the rangers stumbled upon him warily following a game trail, weak and dehydrated. So much so that he almost didn't react when he saw them and thought he was dreaming it. Apparently, some locals had told his parents of a similarly described creature from native folklore, a massive, hairy, bipedal creature. But nothing could ever be authenticated. Whether Tommy's terrifying encounter was with that same creature or something else entirely remains a chilling mystery that they all want to leave in the past. But his family is just grateful to have him home, safe and sound. Alright, so what happened to me happened on the battlefield in Gettysburg. Now you might think a Civil War battlefield wouldn't be the most relaxing place for a school field trip. But hey, it's history, right? History right there where it happened. My class, a bunch of 15-year-olds with more energy than a pack of squirrels hopped up on jelly beans, were about as enthused about the trip as they were about dissecting frogs in biology. Standard teenage fare, meaning they were totally uninterested. Except for David. David was different. Quiet kid, always sat in the front row, soaking up information like a sponge. Didn't talk much, but his eyes held a curiosity that most teenagers seem to lose somewhere between Minecraft and TikTok. Maybe that's why he was the first one to spot them. The day had been long. We trudged through fields, squinted at faded monuments, and listened to me drone on about Pickett's charge and the importance of preserving historical sites. By the time we reached the wheat field, the heart of some of the bloodiest fighting, the sun was starting to dip below the horizon. Long shadows stretched across the trampled grass, and a cool breeze whispered through the skeletal remains of trees. An eerie silence had settled over the battlefield, broken only by the excited chatter of my students finally sensing the weight of history. That's when David nudged me. I remember it clearly. The slight pressure on my elbow, the way his eyes darted towards the darkening sky. "Mr. Evans," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the rustling leaves. "What's that?" I followed his gaze and felt a prickle crawl up my neck. 3 lights. Not stars, not airplanes. These were different. Perfectly white, hovering motionless in the twilight. No blinking red beacons, no steady hum of engines. Just there, like silent sentinels guarding the hallowed ground. The chatter from the students died down to nervous murmurs. "UFOs?" someone breathed, the word echoing through the stillness. I forced a laugh, trying to maintain some semblance of control. "Relax, everyone," I said, my voice a touch higher than usual. "Probably just some experimental drone or something the military is testing." Secretly, though, a knot of unease tightened in my gut. Drones don't usually come in threes, let alone hang perfectly still in the air like celestial Christmas ornaments. For what felt like an eternity, the lights remained. 10 minutes, 15. Time seemed to warp in the face of the unknown. The students grew restless, some fidgeting, some craning their necks for a better look. Even David, usually the picture of stoicism, had a touch of wide-eyed wonder on his face. Then, just as abruptly as they appeared, the lights vanished. One by one, they blinked out of existence, leaving behind an inky blackness that felt weirdly oppressive. A collective gasp escaped the students, and a wave of nervous energy washed over the group. The walk back to the bus was subdued. Gone were the usual jokes and horseplay. Instead, a thoughtful silence hung heavy in the air. Back on the bus, the chatter remained muted. Even the most boisterous students seemed subdued by the experience. That night, after everyone else had gone to bed, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I grabbed my laptop and dove down a research rabbit hole. Military exercises, no dice, experimental aircraft prototypes, nothing that matched the silent, hovering trio. Frustration gnawed at me. Was I going to let a bunch of unexplained lights turn me into a believer in little green men? Days turned into weeks, and the memory of the lights remained. David, usually reticent, would occasionally catch my eye and offer a small, knowing smile. It was as if we shared a secret, a silent pact of bewilderment. Finally, I decided to reach out to a local historical society, figuring maybe there was some forgotten legend, some spooky battlefield ghost story that could explain the lights. The librarian, a kind-faced woman with more wrinkles than a Shar-Pei puppy, listened patiently to my tale. "Interesting," she mused, tapping away on her dusty computer. "There have been whispers over the years, sightings of strange lights, particularly around the anniversary of the battle." She pulled out a leather-bound book, its pages yellowed with age. "Here," she pointed to a faded passage. "Account of peculiar lights witnessed by a Union soldier during the battle itself. Describe them as ethereal orbs, guiding lost souls." My heart hammered in my chest. Could there be a connection? Was there something more to the Gettysburg battlefield than just history textbooks and tour guides? The answer, it seems, remains as elusive as those silent hovering lights themselves. Maybe it was just a strange quirk of nature, a meteorological phenomenon. Or maybe, just maybe, there's a truth hidden beneath the soil of Gettysburg. Whatever the explanation, the experience left a permanent mark on all of us. It chipped away at the edges of my scientific certainty, reminding me that the universe holds mysteries beyond mathematical equations on a blackboard. And that, for a science teacher who always prided himself on logic and reason, was a realization both unsettling and strangely exhilarating. It was May 24th, 2022, when John Davis, a 36-year-old accountant from St. George, Utah, set out for a day hike through the remote Kolob Canyon section of Zion National Park. An avid outdoorsman, John had been hiking in Zion many times over the years and knew the area well. He pulled into the Kolob Canyon's parking lot around 8 a.m. that Tuesday morning. It was already a sunny day with temperatures forecast to reach the low 80s. Perfect hiking weather. After doubling checking his pack, which contained plenty of snacks, water, first aid supplies, and other essentials, John locked his truck and hopped on the Lavercan Creek Trail. The first couple hours went smoothly, as John steadily made his way deeper into the Slick Rock Canyon terrain. He spotted some bighorn sheep along the way and stopped to observe them through his binoculars for a while. Continuing on, John started gaining significant elevation, while the path narrowed considerably, squeezing between towering cliff walls. Around 11 a.m., John reached the junction for the lesser-traveled Horse Ranch Mountain Trail, which branched off towards the right. He had hiked that route a few times before and decided to take it today too. The trail quickly became much more rugged and overgrown compared to the main paths he'd just been on. After scrambling over deadfall and pushing through thick vegetation for about an hour, John finally emerged into a more open area scattered with scrub oak, juniper trees, and sandstone boulders. Feeling a bit drained from the intense morning hike, he plopped down on a flat rock to re-energize with a protein bar and some Gatorade. As John ate, he couldn't shake the strange feeling that he wasn't the only one in the area. He peered around the rocky outcroppings and clusters of thick oak brush, but didn't notice anything out of the ordinary at first. Then, something moving in the vegetation about 100 yards away caught his eye and made him hone in on that area. Squinting, John could just make out what appeared to be a massively large, hair-covered figure lurking behind the scrub oak. At first, he obviously thought it was just a random mountain animal, but the enormous size and upright bipedal walking stance quickly dispelled that notion. This creature was easily over 8 feet tall, and that's not something you're supposed to see out here, or anywhere for that matter. John stumbled a bit as the realization washed over him that he was encountering something entirely unknown. And that's when the lumbering, hair-covered beast slowly emerged further into the open, affording John a terrifyingly clear view of its features. The creature sported long, powerful arms. Its upper body was incredibly broad and thickly muscled. The flat, protruding brow and deep-set eyes underneath gave it an ape-like appearance, but its facial structure was not normal in terms of looking like any other animal. It almost looked human-like in a bizarre and unsettling way. The beast turned its head from side to side, seeming to scan the area with curiosity, while ambling slowly in John's direction on 2 massive hair-covered legs. Its unhurried, polished movements seemed to convey a silent sense of confidence, which was terrifying to know that it was not in the least bit scared or nervous. John remained utterly motionless as the creature steadily approached. He knew any abrupt movements could potentially provoke an attack. At the same time, he didn't dare run away either. He'd never be able to outpace whatever this unnatural beast was. Soon, the towering, hair-covered monstrosity was only around 30 feet away from John, seemingly studying the frightened hiker with a cautious yet piercing gaze. John caught whiffs of its strong, musky odor coming towards him in the light breeze. The creature repeatedly swiveled and cocked its head, reminding John of the mannerisms of an intelligent predator, carefully evaluating its surroundings and watching its every move, maybe even getting ready to pounce on him. The thought of it almost made him hurl. Then, just as inexplicably as it had arrived, the beast suddenly turned its head in the opposite direction and lifted its nose in the air. John looked and listened in that direction, but saw and heard nothing. Then the creature made a sound that seemed like it was calling out, or maybe answering. Of course, John had no idea. And then it brought its head down, looked at him one more time, and then strode away, disappearing once again into the thick vegetation and rocky terrain. John didn't dare move a muscle until it was long out of sight, and he felt some small twinge of being safe. When he finally felt brave enough, John gathered his belongings with shaking hands and backtracked out of the canyon at a frantic pace, desperate to get away from the isolated area and whatever unholy thing he had just encountered. He didn't stop moving until reaching his truck, quickly jumping inside and locking the doors. To this day, John refuses to hike anywhere near that part of Zion again. While he remains unable to explain precisely what he saw out there, he knows beyond any doubt that it was something unknown to modern science. The raw primordial terror of coming face to face with that ancient, hair-covered monstrosity has haunted him ever since. A few years back, I had this experience in Zion National Park, Utah. Beautiful place, but kind of eerie too. I work as a park ranger there. Zion at night is like a whole other world. The cliffs tower over you. The moon throws these long shadows. It's almost magical at night. Usually it's peaceful, but around the Virgin River, sometimes you get this weird, eerie feeling. That's how it was that night. I've spent most of my career at Zion patrolling trails, looking out for campers, checking on wildlife, sometimes even helping in search and rescue. Sure, the park can feel a bit spooky sometimes, but the peace it offers and the satisfaction I get more than makes up for it. That particular night, I was up doing a routine check around the Virgin River area with Tim, a colleague and a good friend of mine. They call us the Late Night Boys, looking after the park while everyone's asleep. That evening, we were doing the usual stuff, checking the trails, making sure campfires were out, and keeping an eye on the wildlife. We keep an eye out at night, making sure the wildlife keeps its distance from campsites and that everything's normal in the animal world. We were having a regular night, with the usual sounds of nature accompanying our tasks when we realized something wasn't right. Out of nowhere, we both felt this weird chill and a strong, kind of unnatural smell, like burnt wood or maybe sulfur. Even though the night was calm, you could feel something off in the air, like we weren't alone. Then it started, these low growls like they were coming up from the ground, and this really eerie howl echoing through the park. It was tough, but we kept it together, trying hard to see where the sound was coming from out there in the dark. One thing was certain, we weren't dealing with any regular animal. That's where things around started to get really dark. I swear, it was like we'd wandered into some place we weren't meant to be, somewhere that should be off limits. It was scary, but also kind of awe-inspiring, like watching a storm roll in. You know it could be bad, but you can't help but be amazed by it. Getting closer to where those sounds seemed to be coming from, we spotted this shadow moving just outside our flashlight's reach. It was large, fast, and it moved in a way that was too deliberate to be just some wild animal. It was hard to see clearly, just this dark, shifting thing against the trees. Those howls and growls kept coming, felt like they were shaking the ground, and that sulfur smell got stronger the closer we got. That was when we realized that we weren't dealing with normal park predators, and our work for the night had just become a lot more dangerous. Suddenly, everything went quiet. It was weirdly silent, not a single sound in the park. I was about to say something when Tim put his hand on my shoulder and pointed to a dark spot over near the river. I followed his line of sight and made an audible gasp as I made out a large silhouette that wasn't there before. At first, I thought it was a bear. It was large, easily standing about 4.5 feet tall at the shoulder, but it wasn't bulky or round like a bear. This thing was incredibly lean and muscular, built more for speed than brute strength. The way it moved was creepy, but what really scared me were its eyes, glowing red in the dark. We didn't move, didn't dare breathe, as we watched the shadowy figure. Then it turned towards us. I could make out matted, dark fur, or maybe scales. It was difficult to distinguish, and it reeked. The scent of sulfur was so strong it made my eyes water. Right when we decided to back away, it growled so loud it felt like the earth shook. I felt the noise resonating, and I was sure, more than ever, we were in its domain now. I don't know how long we stood there, locked in by terror, as the beast regarded us silently. Then, with a suddenness that had us startled, it leapt away, the land quaking slightly as it took off. We watched its glowing eyes vanish into the night, and then everything was silent again, really silent. Back at the station, we couldn't sleep, just sat there drinking coffee and thinking about what happened. We thought we knew the woods, but this really got to us. The encounter made my park rounds during the night shift a lot more terrifying, but it also made me realize how much we don't know about what happens in the woods at night. Mostly, we kept this to ourselves, like an unspoken thing between me and Tim, but the memory of it lives on, and sometimes we share it amongst our closest friends. Whether it was a product of our adrenaline-fueled imaginations or something more sinister, we'll never really know. But those menacing, fiery eyes and the growls that echoed through the night felt all too real to be dismissed entirely. Now, when I do my late-night rounds, it's not just about checking for campfires or wildlife. Let's just say I've got a new respect for the night, for everything in it, both seen or unseen. Weird stuff like this really shows what my job's about. Protecting, serving, even when it's something unexplainable out there in the dark, and even when it's dangerous. Since that night, the way I see the park, the night, it's all changed. There's so much we don't know. Honestly, the whole thing started subtly. We moved to this old farmhouse in rural Vermont last summer. It wasn't exactly our dream home, but Jessica and I craved a change from the city, and the little farmhouse had a certain charm: weathered gray shingles, a wraparound porch, and a view of rolling green hills that seemed to stretch on forever. The locals called it the Hollow Creek House, which we thought was kind of neat at first. Everything seemed normal for the first few weeks. The usual creaks and groans of an old house, sure, but nothing out of the ordinary. Then, Jessica started noticing things going missing. Small things at first: a favorite pair of earrings, a pack of her herbal tea. They'd always turn up later, in the most peculiar places, tucked under a floorboard, behind a picture frame that hadn't been moved in years. We joked about a mischievous house spirit, but the playful mood faded when the occurrences became more frequent. One night, I was working late in the study, a converted room off the main living area. It had a large brick fireplace, the kind that took up most of one wall. It wasn't lit that night, but I swear I felt a sudden, inexplicable drop in temperature. It wasn't a draft, more like a concentrated pocket of icy air that seemed to emanate from the fireplace itself. I reached out to touch the brick, expecting it to be cold, but it felt oddly warm. Goosebumps prickled my skin and a wave of unease washed over me. I shut down my laptop and called it a night, the feeling lingering even after I retreated downstairs. The cold spots became a regular occurrence. Sometimes it would be in the kitchen, hovering near the pantry door. Other nights, it would be by the old rocking chair on the porch, creaking gently even though nobody was sitting in it. We started leaving thermometers around the house, trying to find a logical explanation, but the readings were always normal. The coldness felt more intentional, like an unwelcome presence marking its territory. Then came the whispers. It started very faintly, almost indistinguishable from the wind rustling through the trees outside. But there were nights, especially when Jessica was away on business trips, when the whispers seemed to intensify. They wouldn't form any words, just a low, slow sound that seemed to slither into my ears from every corner of the house. I'd lie awake in bed, heart pounding, straining to understand what they were saying. One particularly bad night, the whispers escalated into a cacophony of raspy voices, each one filled with malice. The temperature plummeted, the air thick and heavy. I huddled under the covers, the sound drilling into my skull. Then a new sound emerged, a rhythmic tapping coming from the floor above me, directly over my head. It wasn't a frantic tapping, but a slow, deliberate beat, like a metronome counting down to something terrible. Paralyzed by fear, I didn't move until dawn. The tapping had stopped by then, but the house was filled with a suffocating silence that was somehow worse. When Jessica returned, I told her everything: the missing items, the cold spots, the whispers. She didn't call me crazy, bless her heart. We did some research online, looked into the history of the house. Apparently, it had been built on the site of an old Native American burial ground. Whether that was connected to the strange occurrences, we didn't know, but the activity only intensified after that. Objects would move on their own. A book flying off a shelf, a rocking chair swaying back and forth with no one near it. The whispers became more frequent, sometimes accompanied by fleeting shadows darting across the periphery of my vision. One night, while Jessica was in the kitchen making tea, the rocking chair on the porch began to creak violently. We both rushed out, hearts hammering in our chests. The chair was rocking back and forth with an inhuman force, empty. A cold wind whipped around us, carrying the stench of decaying leaves and something else, something foul and ancient. Jessica screamed, a high-pitched sound that tore through the night air. The rocking chair stopped abruptly. The wind died down. A heavy silence descended upon us, broken only by Jessica's ragged breaths. Then, from the depths of the house, a single chilling laugh echoed through the halls. We didn't need to look at each other to know what we had to do. We packed our bags that night, threw some clothes and essentials into duffel bags, not bothering to sort or fold. Sleep was the furthest thing from our minds. The mocking laughter still echoed in our heads, a constant reminder of the unseen entity that had invaded our home. We piled into the car, the engine sputtering to life like a reluctant sigh. As we pulled away, I glanced back at the farmhouse. It stood bathed in the pale moonlight, the windows like empty eyes staring after us. The next few weeks were a blur of motels, cheap takeout, and a gnawing sense of unease. We contacted a local paranormal investigator we found online, a woman named Miss Walsh with a no-nonsense attitude and a collection of EMF readers and voice recorders that looked straight out of a science fiction movie. Miss Walsh arrived at the farmhouse on a crisp autumn afternoon, her arrival a welcome change from the sterile hotel rooms. She spent the entire day meticulously examining the house, taking readings with her strange devices, and asking us detailed questions about the activity we'd experienced. She confirmed what we already knew. The house was definitely haunted, and by something powerful. It could be a residual haunting, she explained, setting down her EMF reader. A fragment of a restless spirit tethered to the location. Or, she added with a grimace, something more dangerous, an entity feeding on fear. The thought sent shivers down my spine. Fear. That's exactly what it felt like the entity wanted, to terrify us, drive us away from the house. We couldn't let it win. We decided to take a stand, to reclaim our home, or at least sell it without looking like complete lunatics. Miss Walsh agreed to help us with a cleansing ritual, a process that involved burning sage bundles, which smelled surprisingly nice, chanting, which felt a little silly, and setting up salt lines around the perimeter of the house, which looked ridiculous, but hey, we were desperate. The night of the ritual, the air crackled with a strange energy. Miss Walsh led us through the chanting, her voice firm and unwavering. The smoke from the sage filled the house, carrying a pungent aroma that tickled our noses. I half expected the rocking chair to start creaking or the whispers to resume, but everything remained eerily silent. As the last pinch of salt was scattered across the threshold, Miss Walsh declared, "We've done all we can do. Now we wait." We waited, for days, for weeks, nothing. No flying objects, no chilling whispers, no entity laughing its head off in the dead of night. Had it worked? Was the house finally free? A sliver of hope began to bloom in my chest. Maybe Miss Walsh was right. Maybe it was just a restless spirit, and our little ritual had sent it on its way. Maybe we could finally reclaim our home. We cautiously unpacked our boxes, the once familiar rooms now imbued with a tentative sense of normalcy. Then, one rainy afternoon, it started again. A faint tapping sound, coming from the attic. My heart lurched. It couldn't be, could it? We raced upstairs, Miss Walsh's instructions echoing in our ears. But the attic was empty, dusty boxes piled high against the slanted walls. The tapping had stopped. We exchanged a worried glance. Was this a one-time occurrence, or the start of something much worse? As of now, the house is quiet again, but the silence feels different this time. It's not peaceful, it's watchful, like the entity is biding its time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. And we're left here wondering if we've truly banished the darkness or simply slammed the door shut on a much bigger problem.